And good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. Happy
Which is it?
early evening. So
Which is it? Evening, early evening, or
it's
afternoon?
early evening, so afternoon into evening. It's both. You see, why do we have to say it's evening or afternoon? Why can't it be both?
Good afternoon, everybody. We can go with that.
I identify as I think we let the day identify what it is.
It's only 4:30. It's still afternoon, technically. Dinner
Okay.
is in the evening, and that's when the sun goes down, and the
I
sun
think-
hasn't gone down yet.
I think morning, afternoon, evening is just a social construct that we've invented.
Oh my goodness. He likes people to make him
Why
make him
can't
think he's really smart, right?
why can't it just
Let's just say hello. How about that?
Okay.
Hello.
hello everybody and welcome to episode
Is it
41
you I'm waiting
of the
for?
Black and White
That's all you
Theology
did, though. Yeah,
Podcast.
we caught that right. Lionel Richie. Yeah, you went right over your head. You didn't even know.
I'm trying to focus on on
Oh man.
I'm trying to focus on all of the people that are trying to
kinda,
glean
you know, it
help
has to
from
do
our-
with music.
from our
So I
podcast.
kind of threw a little Lionel Richie out there, and we can talk about. Actually, Lionel Richie did that spiritual song, right? Jesus is love, right? Remember that Lionel Richie tune? Jesus is love, Father.
Is that before or after All Night Long?
That,
That was a very spiritual song, too. I'm gonna mute my mic now, again.
well, yeah. Go mute yourself, man. All right, are you ready, man? You-
Yeah, I'm just trying to decide if I actually like the super chill cherry cola or not. I just
Lionel Richie
It's-
all night long,
yeah.
cola.
yeah
Let's get focused.
yeah it just has a weird
We're
taste.
Worship Wars and generic soda reviews.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Generic soda reviews.
Oh, that's a no-brainer
That'll get
soda.
more. Yeah.
Oh,
Well, this
okay.
is super chill. I got it at Landis
Oh,
Supermarket.
super chill.
Super chill,
Yeah.
and it's super chill. It's supposed to be cherry cola.
Yeah, yeah.
It
No, man. If I'm going to drink soda, I'm just going to drink the main brands. Just go get yourself a Pepsi Cherry Cola.
Liz just asked you what's wrong with your drink.
yeah. Well, now she knows. So you don't drink the generic sodas?
No, not anymore. And maybe because I was raised in the hood and we were raised on that
Well,
stuff.
I was about to say. It sounds
Like,
like
we-
it sounds
we-
like you
we-
have quite a bit of privilege.
Well, now
be
I
able
do.
to- oh, now you
now
do.
I do. Back then I didn't. You know what I mean? We just had the can that would just said soda on it. And you didn't know the flavor until you popped it open and drank it. Right? You know? So anyway.
No, I don't know.
No,
I
that's
drink-
true. No, you don't know. That's right.
No,
Yeah,
come
yeah,
on,
No, you don't.
I grew up on Sam's Choice cola.
Sam's Choice.
Sam's
Dude, I
Choice.
grew up on no frill soda.
That's Sam's
We
Choice.
got our
Yeah.
soda from a back of a big white truck that came to the church once a Saturday
Yeah,
and got
yeah.
your block cheese
Yeah,
and your
government
bread.
cheese. Yeah.
Yeah, and your big thing that said peanut butter on it.
I'll-
Yeah, we know that was our Sam's Club.
My grandmother gave me water, told me it was God soda. That was it.
That's a smart lady. That was good.
I stand in solidarity with your struggle.
Oh my goodness.
How's that?
All right. No,
All right, Ron, where are we going today?
We are still talking about worship, defining worship.
Well, is that notes? You got notes? Look at you.
You know, as we continue to talk about music and defining worship, the worship wars that we went through, right?
We
went
did.
through.
We did, yeah.
Got some medals from that
Oh,
war.
by the way, hold that thought.
Oh boy, here we go.
Hopefully, you guys can hear us better today. If you're listening, but you're not listening live, don't leave a comment saying we can't hear you because we're not live. Okay. But if you're listening live, like I see two on YouTube right now. If you're
Man,
having a
our
hard time
numbers are
hearing us,
going
let us
up.
know. Leave a comment in the chat section. Say, hey, turn us up. We will turn you up. We're using a new computer. We bought a new computer.
Yeah.
And last week, I turned the volume down.
Oh, is that
it
what
was
happened?
it was me. It was me. I'm not going to throw Dan under the bus for
Man,
this
he's
one.
taking ownership
Yeah,
on that.
yeah.
That's awesome.
And so
Okay.
it was a little hard to hear. So we recognize that. We apologize for that. And hopefully you can hear us a little better
Hopefully
today. If
everybody
you're having
can hear us.
problems
Yeah.
hearing us, we'll turn you up. We'll turn us up a little more. That's on Dan this
Yeah.
week. So if you
right.
can't hear us this week, it is Dan's fault. Go ahead, Ron.
All right, so we're talking about worship wars, right? And it's funny because when you talk about the worship wars, everybody immediately goes to what? Music.
Music, yep.
And that's one of the things when I came here to faith 17 years ago. You believe it was that long ago, man? Wait, was I still with Monique? Yeah, 17 years ago, everybody wanted to talk about music. Well, what's this new music guy going to do? What's this new music guy going to do, right? And my heartbeat, honestly, was, can we talk about worship?
Yeah.
Because music is just one means of worshiping God, right? So I think it's important, as we discuss these worship wars, and what we're talking about in the context of music, it's directly related to how you define worship and what you say worship is.
Yeah.
If you understand worship, I'm convinced, I could be wrong.
You're convinced you could be wrong?
No, let me finish. Okay. See, that's how you get people in trouble. You be splicing what they say, right? But if we get worship right, I'm convinced that all of the fighting over the music would have been greatly minimized.
Yeah.
If we understand worship.
And I think to your point, that's been my personal experience, that when we direct the conversation to a theological, biblical view of worship,
Right.
the music issue tends to fall in its proper place.
Absolutely. Yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
Whereas I think what we were discussing last week, and if you missed last week's episode, go back and watch, because we really looked at the arguments made against certain styles of music being honorable to God or not honorable to God. And we evaluated that. But the point in all of that is the music was at the forefront.
Right.
And worship, it almost was like back here.
Secondary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if what I hear you saying is if you get the order right and talk about a biblical theology of worship, the music will fall into its proper place, and then you can actually have a conversation about music.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's kind of the route we're actually trying to go with the podcast here. So last week we kind of tackled, what is a biblically, what does the Bible say about just music itself? Is it amoral? Is it a moral agent? Is there music that is wicked music, just the music, or is there music that is specifically the music that God says, this is my music?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so if you miss, we won't get into that again, but if you missed that, go back and listen. And so what we want to do today is say, okay, let's put music in its proper context or its proper place. Let's direct our attention right now to just talking about worship.
Yeah. So what is worship? How do we define worship, right? And if you think about worship not in terms of music, but in terms of a lifestyle, as a believer who understands that it is only by the grace of God, the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ, that I have been reconciled to a holy God, right? That I stand totally justified, forgiven, because of the work of Christ on the cross. If I understand that, the natural response to that should be a life of worship. Right? As a matter of fact, if you read Romans, right, for 11 chapters, he kind of unpacks righteousness and comes to Romans 12. How are you righteous? Through faith alone, Christ alone. Then he comes to chapter 12 and starts out how. Now, in light of all of that, I urge you, present your life a living sacrifice.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So just examining the structure of Romans, how Paul defends justification by faith. Right? And unpacks, in some detail what the gospel is.
Yep.
And then as we develop a clear understanding of what the gospel is, now we can begin to tackle some of the issues within Christian living.
That's right. Yep.
That people have disagreements over and things like that.
Yep.
And so I think it's a really good point. Keep the gospel forefront, keep the gospel primary, keep the gospel centered.
Yep.
Right? And as we do that, then let's have a healthy conversation about some of the things that we might disagree over within the church.
Right. Absolutely.
And finding proper categories for those issues is important too. And I think we're going to try to do that with music today and place it in its proper category.
Yep. So whether it's music, which obviously we're talking about, whatever it is that I do, I'm going to present it with kind of like a gospel-centric view.
Yep.
Understanding who I am in Christ, what Christ has done, I'm going to start with that and now approach everything I do. And that's why I say it's a lifestyle. You know, he says to present your life, your body, a living sacrifice, which is your reasonable, what? Spiritual worship or service, if you will. So I think that is crucial. And that's, in talking about any topic, if we start there, you know, as you said in the beginning, then some of these issues will fall right in place where they need to be. So worship, I'm going to define worship, me responding to God in light of what God did through Christ.
Okay. And I the only thing I would add to that, because I agree with that, is responding to what God has done in Christ, but it's also responding to who God is. What, you know,
Right.
who God is.
Absolutely.
So I was kind of twofold: who God is and what He's done,
And what He's done,
what He's
yes.
accomplished.
Absolutely.
So what He's
Absolutely.
accomplished flows from His nature.
Right.
Right. And so I think if we focus on one without the other, I think that we flirt with maybe imbalance. So if we focus on just what God has done,
Right.
without also focusing on who He
is
is,
and His very character, His
Right.
very nature.
right? We
Yes.
may not understand why He has done what He has done.
Exactly. Sure.
Right.
Yep.
If we only focus on His character and nature without talking about what He's done, we never get to actually the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Right.
And I think that's a real danger, because I think there's a lot of, say, even Christian worship music out there that talks about the nature of God,
Yep.
and His love, and He loves me, and He's just the God of love, and that's true.
It's part of His character.
And we should sing about that. We should celebrate that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But what did His love produce?
Yeah.
It produced a blood-stained cross.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying every song that talks about love also has to ultimately be sung about I think it's fine, in full disclosure, to sing a song that is just about the love
it's
of God.
emphasizing the love of God.
Right?
Right.
Right. If you'd have to try and fit the attributes of God and the gospel and all of these things into every song, right? But to the point, and this is something that Dan and I kind of try to work through as we plan out our services here at Faith with regards to the preaching and the music, is okay, here's a song that emphasizes this aspect.
Right.
But let's try and find a song now that emphasizes this as well.
Yeah.
And so as we intentionally plan the music, the songs that we're going to sing, there's intentionality behind it to kind of cover not just the nature of God, but also the acts of God, the work of God.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
yeah.
Going back to our definition, though, so let's
Yeah.
just get clarity around it. I think we would define worship as our response. Okay, so unpack that just for a minute, if you can. Just the importance of that statement, our response to
who
God
God
is and what He's done.
Yeah. So everything I do in my life relationally, my interactions with other people, my own personal choices that I make, my goals, my ambitions for my life, it all should be emanating from who God is and what God has done. So even and let me give you a real practical example, right? Because there's thousands of examples, right? Even if I'm talking to a brother or sister who disagrees with me on, say, an issue like, I don't know, music, okay? If I'm living a life of worship unto God, then even the way I respond to that brother or sister that I disagree with, they might be animated, they might even be outright angry at me. But in light of understanding who God is and what God has done, my response in that moment, I'm going to have my words be seasoned with grace and humility. I'm going to speak the truth in love. Because of the gospel, it's going to affect how I interact with people relationally.
So are you saying, Ron, that worship happens outside of us singing
The 20-minute song
Yes,
service,
yes.
or in the black church, the 2-hour song service.
Yes, is
which
that what you're
highly
saying?
more biblical, but yes, I am.
So what you're saying, Ron, if I understand you right, is I can actually worship God in how I relate to brothers and sisters around me. And
Absolutely.
okay,
Absolutely.
So if to kind of rephrase what you just said, because I think it's good. If I understand who God is and I understand what He's done for me,
Right,
that
right.
kind of two-pronged aspect of worship, then my response will be dictated by my understanding of who God is.
Absolutely.
So my response to you will flow from my understanding of who God is
Yeah.
and what He's done for me.
Right.
So an act of worship can happen in my response to you.
Absolutely.
And I think
Absolutely.
that can be a powerful thing because I don't think many people think about worship
No.
through that
No,
lens.
I agree. I mean, we could be standing in the parking lot of a store, and I could be worshiping God in that moment. By the
because
way,
you're lifting your hands and singing?
No, by the way I'm responding to you,
Okay.
right? And I think this is what Paul was getting at when, like, the whole totality of your life should be presented as a living sacrifice. And think about the terminology he uses in Romans 12 there. Why did he say living sacrifice? What is he thinking about? I mean, the Jewish mindset would have gone back to what? The temple, the sacrifices, right? We are offering our best to God. Thank God I don't have to be the best because Christ was and he died for me. But so it's wrapped up in everything I do, not just Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Not just Sunday morning.
So how you treat your wife when you get home from work? How you interact
yeah.
with your kids?
Your kids, your
how
boss.
How you deal with
The guy who cut you off.
Yeah, right.
It's yeah. And
how
I
do you
think
deal with the guy who cut you off? You deal
I
with that
usually
pretty
send
well.
up a prayer in Hebrew for them.
Yeah, okay. In Hebrew. Wow. that is so spiritual, man.
But I think part of the problem when we talk about worship, we compartmentalize it. We relegate it to Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Quite frankly.
Yep.
And then when we walk out, it's like
Well, some people broaden it to their Word FM radio station in their car. They
Yeah.
worship in their car.
right. Well, that's good. That's an extension. Keep it going, right? And then when they get home, it's like, okay, well, that was good. Next Sunday we'll
Yeah,
do it
I got
again.
done worshiping on my 20-minute ride home from work.
Right,
Now I
right.
would come in and make dinner for the
Yep.
family, and worship's over.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so it's a mindset of having this keen awareness of who God is and what God has done at all times. So if I'm keeping that mindset, it should affect every single aspect of my life.
So response is or worship is a response.
Yep.
So if we have clarity and an understanding of who God is, and I think one of the reasons we don't worship well is because we don't really know who God is, His
Right.
character, His nature.
Right.
And we know that He's died for us. But what does that mean?
Yeah.
Really? What does justification mean? What does it mean that He absorbed the wrath of God? What does His act of obedience mean? What does it mean that He offers us a perfect righteousness that He clothes us in, right? So there's so much depth to the gospel that the further you mine the truths of the gospel, the more you see the character and the nature of God. What that produces within you is worship. So I would take you to one of the great worship scenes in all of the Bible, and that's in the book of Revelation, right? Where the 24 elders they're standing around the throne, and there's the one seated on the throne, and then the scroll is given, and John weeps because there's no one found worthy, to open the scroll and to break the seals and
Yeah.
open the scroll,
Yeah.
right? And then the elder comes to John and says, "Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He has conquered so that he is worthy to open the scroll." And then John turns, and rather than seeing a lion, what's he see? A lamb standing
Yeah.
as though it had been slain.
Yeah.
So this mixed metaphor of the slain lamb of God becomes the conquering Lion of Judah,
Yeah.
who is now worthy. And then you have this scene where they fall down and they worship. Worthy is he to receive honor and glory and
Yeah.
blessing and power. And so there's this incredible worship scene. Well, why are they worshiping? Because their worship is simply just a response to the glory of the Lamb, the Lion of Judah,
Yeah.
who is worthy.
Yeah.
And so when we know who God is and when we understand what He's done, and there's depth to that, there's depth to our worship. I think one of the struggles that we all see within modern American evangelicalism is the depth of our worship only goes, as deep as the ability for the morning worship leader to
move you.
to stir us.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
With his playing or his vocals
Yep.
or the environment that's created. And
Yeah.
I'm not against creating an environment or music done with excellence and things like that. But if the depth of our worship is dependent upon what the guy on stage is doing,
Yes.
I think we have a pretty shallow understanding
And,
of worship.
see, this is something that would get me when I would hear people say this, like after a service, people, hey, you're talking fellowship and say, hey, how did you like your service? And then they would say this comment, well, I didn't get much out of it. I didn't get much out of it. And that always kind of perplexed me because I would sit there and say, okay, songs were sung that are pointing to Christ. The word of God was preached. You're a believer, Holy Spirit's on the inside of you, and you didn't get anything out of that? I don't understand that. And a lot of times when I would push a little bit and say, well, I don't understand, like why? Well, the music just didn't do it for me. So you weren't moved by the music. Why? Well, this is not my cup of tea. And that became the total litmus test on whether or not a worship experience happened because I wasn't moved by the music.
Yeah.
That is a flawed understanding of even what the gathering is for on Sunday morning. But the word was preached, the sacraments were done, the offering, I didn't get much out of it. The music didn't move me. And that's I think that's our contemporary evangelical mindset today. Like, I want to be moved. I don't like the restaurant. I don't like what was on the menu. And it's like you're losing sight of who God is and what God did.
Yeah.
Because your response should have been based on who God is and what he did, not because you like that song.
Yeah.
It's backwards.
Yeah.
It's
We're looking for something to connect with us emotionally.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with an emotional
Not
connection.
at all. Not at all. We hope that
God
you are-
made us
yeah.
emotional people. I'm an emotional guy.
Yeah.
I think God is a God of emotion, but that's not the totality of whether I can worship and experience God. And that's, so when people come to me, even when I was here, and they say, "Oh, you don't understand." I say, I don't understand, dude. None of this music is my cup of tea.
Yeah.
And yet I can worship God because I'm focusing on what he did for me and who he is. And if it's coming through a genre of music that I don't necessarily like, I'm focusing on the truth. Right?
Right.
I'm not going to have my worship be predicated upon my style of music is played. Now, let's be honest. Would I rather worship in a setting where it's my style of music? Of course I would. That's what I'm more comfortable with. That's what I grew up with. That's what I enjoy. Nothing wrong with that. But that's not a non-negotiable. Like I need to have
Right.
that in order to worship.
Right. I think
That's the difference.
Yeah, I think there is a sense that I need to have that, and if I don't have that, then how am I going to worship,
Right,
Doug?
right,
How am I going to
exactly.
connect with God?
Right. Right.
Like it's dependent upon what the guy on stage is doing,
Yep.
the style of music that's being
Yeah.
played, the atmosphere that's created in the
Yeah.
building that I'm in.
And that's big now, right? You probably get the same emails I get with all these people who want to show you how to create an atmosphere of worship in your church.
Yeah.
This Easter, those are starting to come down now.
Yeah.
Email.
Yeah.
Have a awesome Easter service. An experience they'll never forget. Look at these new video clips, and if you put that with this music,
Yeah.
I'm like, really?
Well, there's this idea of the need to create an experience.
Yep.
And so we see that worship services are being redefined as worship experiences.
Absolutely. You want to give your people a good experience. You know
Right.
why? So they'll come back. And I'm like, no, I want to give them a proper theological understanding of who God is and what he did so they will fall down and worship God.
Yeah.
And not one chord has to be strung for that to happen.
Now you can utilize different tools like music, like visual aids.
Nothing
like,
wrong with it.
You know,
Nothing wrong with it.
you can create certain settings. Certain settings are conducive for worshiping, through music and stuff like that. I'm not saying don't focus on those. I mean, even here at Faith, we take some time and we think about, hey, how do we want the lighting to be for this, right? What
right.
do we want to project on the, on the stage or the walls or whatever?
Right.
How do you want this song to sound? When do you want the drums to come in? When
Sure.
do you want, how do
Sure.
you want it to be arranged, right? We
Yeah.
think about all of
And
those
there's nothing
things.
wrong with it, like
but
you
that
said.
stuff does not create worship.
That's the difference. That doesn't create worship because you can have all of that stuff at a concert
Oh, yeah.
that's done at a high technical level And that's why people go to concerts and they have an experience.
Well, and I think that's part of the struggle is if you are a small country church and you don't have the resources and the people to put something like that together, people don't feel like they're coming to your. You may faithfully, sing songs of truth, and you may faithfully, out of key or with a bad piano player, and you may faithfully administer the word and the sacraments, and people walk away and say,
Nah, that didn't move me.
"Yeah,
didn't
I don't
move
get
me.
anything out of that."
See, and that's a great point, man. And one of the things where I saw that like so starkingly, and it just like I was like, wow, is when I went to China, and I'm sitting in the underground church, worshiping on a Sunday.
Yeah.
No PowerPoint, no Song Show Plus, no guitar, no piano, no bass. Me, Chinese brothers and sisters in a room about half this size, worshiping God, singing, not even with their full voice, but in a hush, lest they be heard and found out.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
right?
And I'm sure, and it was authentic.
Oh man, it was authentic. And praying for one another and hearing the word preached. And so again, and I'm not saying those other things are bad, but you don't need those things. They can come alongside worship,
Yeah.
but you don't need that to worship.
Yeah.
What you need is the word of God and an understanding of who God is and what he
Yeah,
did.
I remember I was in Entebbe, Uganda, at one point, and a similar circumstance. I was walking through a neighborhood on, I think it was a Sunday afternoon, and there was a church service going on in this open air kind of pavilion thing, and it didn't sound great. As far as hey, check this out! That the worship band is really cooking in there. They didn't have one.
Right.
They didn't even have instrumentation. They just
Yeah.
had people in there singing.
Yep.
And worshiping, and they were completely engaged
Yeah.
in what was going on. And they didn't have anything, no lighting, no smoke on the stage, none of
Cue
that.
the fog machine.
It was just the people of God
Yep.
coming together and singing the songs they had with
Yeah.
what little they had. And I remember walking by thinking, okay, that's the heart of it, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's kind of like, remember the song When the Music Fades?
Yeah.
And,
When the music fades,
and all is stripped away. The heart of worship.
all
Worship
is
by
stripped
Matt Redman.
away.
Yeah.
Heart of
That's the
worship,
point
right?
of that
Yeah.
that song,
It
right?
is.
Strip away everything. What's at the heart
I
of worship?
do like the words of that song,
Yeah.
right? I'm going back to the heart of worship.
Yeah.
It's all about you.
Yeah.
You remember I used to have the little finger?
I do. We have video of you. Before, well,
Because I wasn't, I wasn't allowed to be too emotional, so I was allowed to go like that.
before this
I'm
series
coming
ends,
back.
we're gonna review some of
No, we are not.
some of the archives,
we
some of the
are
video
not.
archives of Ron's.
Ron leading music in a whole different church. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
All right,
Let's keep
so
moving.
we've hit on this even just now, but what place does music have then in our worship? If worship is more than just music, what place then does music have within worship?
Well, it's a part of the coming together of God's people, and as Colossians and Ephesians says, singing songs, making melody in our hearts. It's something that from the before the first century church was a part of worship. They had worship in the temple, in the Old Testament. When you read a lot of the Psalms, there are songs. You'll see some of the headings of the Psalms where it'll say the sons of Korah. These are the people who led music, right? So music is a big part of worship.
Yeah, God created music.
God created
God is a musical God, so we would agree
Absolutely.
with some of the things that Garlock said in the video last week.
Lucifer was the minister of music for all intensive purposes.
And so music has a massive place in worship,
Absolutely, it's huge.
and music is a powerful tool.
Yeah, it's because it is a language.
Yeah,
It is a language, and when you attach truth to melody, it's powerful because it sticks. I mean, all of us right in here, if somebody came in and start singing little excerpts of childhood songs, it would throw you right back to like, man, I remember that. Oh my goodness, I remember where I was, right?
yeah,
When I hear music will just kind of put you right back in that spot. How much more powerful when it takes you to an attribute of God, right? So it has a very big place in the gathering of God's people, celebrating worship together. It's huge. Absolutely.
So, if music is all moral in the sense that the notes themselves on the paper, the sound that's created, if we say that there's no inherent good or bad in the actual melody or the music or the beat or whatever, which is what we kind of combated in our podcast last week, because that's the teaching of some, that the music itself has an inherent moral
E
quality.
minor chord has evil in it versus an E major chord.
Right. So if music is all moral, are there any particular styles of music that you would say are inappropriate for worship? So there is, within the context of worship, or even what we do for worship in the church, that which is what I would say in the category, I guess, of appropriateness. So we're not talking about this is wrong and you are completely wrong and you're sinning by doing this. But is it appropriate? So let's talk, because that's where we're going to find a lot of tension, I think, in that category of what we would say, well, that's not sinful, that's not wrong, but
it's not appropriate.
But is that appropriate, right?
Yeah.
So, other questions for you.
So you get to write them, I get to answer them. Well, see,
That's the way this works, right?
Here's the issue. And it kind of goes into the next question.
Yeah.
Because these two are related.
Yep.
So when you say, is this not appropriate? Is this style of music not appropriate? I'm going to have to answer it and say it depends. It depends on what? It depends on what culture are we talking about.
You're so relativistic and postmodern in your answer.
No, because when you talk to someone and they say that's inappropriate, they're saying that from a cultural bias.
Okay.
Number one, if we're honest. And they're saying it from a cultural bias and what the culture has associated that with, which may be something immoral.
Yeah.
Okay? So I totally get that. And I know this is inappropriate. Why? Because this was used for this out in the world and it's associated with this. Therefore, that's appropriate to do here. That being said, well, that's for you and your culture. What about the person who has no point of reference to that? And if music is truly amoral in the sense of a G minor chord is fine, just like a G major chord, you have now an association to that sequence because of your culture. Yeah. What about this guy here who doesn't? See, that's the problem. And so what happens is whatever is stamped in your heart culturally, you can't now superimpose that on another culture. Because what's your point of reference for why you're saying it's inappropriate? Your culture. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So
and now you become the standard rather than a theological reason.
So you would say worship styles are primarily cultural.
Absolutely, they are.
And so cultural context will, in a large part, determine the style of music or the style of worship.
And where you are, where you're ministering. Again, I'll give you this example. Over in Togo. We're in Togo. We're sitting there getting ready for the service, and they start singing in French. Okay, this is West Africa. And I look at my friend Honoré, and I'm like, that's not African music. That's Blessed Assurance. Singing it in French. And he just started laughing. I said, man, I came all the way over here to Togo to hear some legit African worship music. And even in that particular church, they were struggling with that. Because the missionaries, when they came over, praise God for them, they brought Western stylistic music and said, this is what's acceptable to God.
Yep.
And so, praise God, they came over, gave the gospel, people came, churches were established. Now the younger generation's coming up saying, that's not our music.
Yeah.
We want to do our cultural music. And
well, what I've even
helping
seen
to work them through that.
in other cultures like Africa is a lot of times, because we have kind of with the internet, kind of a global kind of culture when it comes to music that's being written in Australia is being done in the United States is now can be downloaded and done by the worship leader in Togo or Uganda or wherever. But what I noticed, even though we might sing some of the same songs, the way in which they sing and the way in which
Stylistically,
they
totally different.
respond, it is very
Yeah,
different.
yeah. Now I'll go the other way, and you remember this. One Sunday we're sitting here at Faith years ago, and a nice group came through from, I won't say what college, it doesn't matter, but you know, brothers of another color, all white brothers, and they said, now we're going to do a spiritual Negro spiritual. And I kind of sat up in my seat a little bit. I said, okay, all right, let's see what they got. And they totally butchered it.
They didn't do
And
justice to the
I'm
spiritual.
gonna be honest. I was a little offended. Now we can talk about what do I mean I was offended, right? But I was like, you know what? If you're gonna do my music, don't go and reinvent it and change it and water it down so it fits your culture. Leave it alone. I was really offended
Well, what
because that
if,
is not how that song goes.
what if we, who have lighter skin color, don't have the ability to do it the way that
It should
your
be done.
culture, should be.
Leave it alone.
Okay, all right.
Stick with what you know. If you don't know how to make greens, don't be boiling nothing on that stove.
right.
Let me make them.
Which is why you know now why I don't attempt things in church.
And I appreciate that. I respect
even
that.
though you give me a little razzing,
I have razzed him for years. When we gonna do some black gospel? But now you understand.
you know.
yeah.
We've dipped our toe a little bit, and it's
You-
never gone
No,
that.
we never have. I talked to him. I thought I did, but it was not.
No, you tried. I was like, what was that?
Like, that's your black gospel.
It sounds like country.
But see, but that's a perfect example, right? Because what I would have loved to ask that quartet that came through. So stylistically, doing a Negro spiritual is not accepted unless it's done through your style. To me, that does more damage than what you're trying to do and slip it in. Hey, it's okay, it's accepted, but you have to do it within my cultural construct.
Right.
That does more damage and division among God's people than just don't do it. Or better yet, if you're gonna do it, it ain't nothing to do with the color of your skin. If you're gonna do it, learn it the way it ought to be sung.
Yeah.
Complete with the rhythms and the clapping and the drums and the syncopation, dare I say. All right, go ahead. I'm a little emotional about that. Just
So,
right on.
So if-
Jesus.
if certain people have certain cultural contexts and certain baggage with regards to certain types of music, it then music style, worship style, then I would say let's put that in its proper category, and that would be the category of what we have traditionally called Christian liberty.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
And so, as we unpack what Christian liberty is, the Apostle Paul gives the example that the first century Corinthian church was struggling with, and that was, do I eat meat that has been offered to a pagan god,
Right.
in a pagan temple? Do I eat that meat? Because this meat that was offered was then sold in the market or sold at the temple, and you could buy it and
Yep.
get some
Yeah.
meat and bring it
Reduced
home.
meat,
and-
discounted meat.
Yeah. Yep. And
That's
it was
all.
pretty common in the culture to eat the meat that was sold at the temple or sold
Yep.
at the market that was offered to an idol, and that god didn't eat it, so they got to do something with it,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And so, unlike the old covenant sacrifices, which were consumed, this meat wasn't, and then it was sold. So in the culture, it was just common that most of the meat that you came across, or a lot of it anyway, that you could get had been offered to an idol, and it was just kind of something that you did. Now, some of that was eaten as worship to the idol, as the pagans would. But the Christians started to struggle with that issue because many of them were saved out of that pagan idol worship.
That's right.
Right? And so they, go to market and they're like, oh, this meat is discounted. And so, hey, yeah, pick up some of that meat. Yeah, that's cheaper. Get that. And they're like, the others were like, no.
Yeah.
You can't eat that meat. That's idol meat.
That's right.
That's wrong. You can't eat that. And other Christians were like, it's just meat.
Yep.
It's no problem.
Yep.
And it created some real struggles with the Gentile Christians there. And so Paul needs to address it because it was creating a lot of division in the church. There were some that were really proud of themselves because they didn't eat the meat offered to the idol. And they were really feeling good about their stand, that they were taking. There were others that were feeling pretty good about themselves because I clearly have more knowledge than they do.
Yeah.
I clearly can exercise my liberty. And so they thought they were better than those who weren't eating the meat because they could exercise their religion or their Christian liberty under grace and eat the meat. And because they had knowledge, they walked around with pride as well. So you had pride on both sides. Those
Yeah.
who were proud because they didn't eat the meat, those who were proud because they did eat the meat.
Yep.
And so when you have that, you have division.
Absolutely.
And we've certainly seen that in the church.
Oh, yeah.
Haven't we?
Oh, yeah.
Those who say, I don't listen to that music.
Yep.
And then I even struggle with this when you swing to the other side. You're like, that's nice. You don't have the knowledge that I have that
Right.
allows me to listen to this music.
Right.
Too
Yeah.
bad for you. You know,
Yeah.
and you feel proud that, oh,
Yeah, and that's arrogant.
yep. mhm.
That's arrogance, which Paul also in the Bible warns against.
This
Do
is
not
why
be arrogant.
in 1 Corinthians he says, knowledge does what?
Puffs up.
But love edifies.
Yep.
And so the key to navigating areas of Christian liberty is love.
Yep.
And that's the point Paul makes throughout 1 Corinthians 8 through 10.
Yeah.
That don't let knowledge puff you up with arrogance. Let love govern how you approach areas of Christian liberty.
Yep.
And for them, it was the meat offered to idol. Now, the Apostle Paul clearly said, yeah, those of you that have knowledge about eating the meat, you're actually right. You can't eat the meat. It's not a sin.
Yeah, that's not a God. We know that's not
Yeah.
a God.
Yeah. But not everyone has that knowledge.
That's right.
So how do you love those people?
Yeah.
And so how does Paul direct them to act in accordance to those who don't have that knowledge?
Yeah, so he says, listen, if I'm going to sit here in the marketplace, and I think that's the key, and I'm going to eat this steak, and it's going to offend you because you think that's
You gotta
wrong.
now you need to define offend because
Right. Offending me, not you just don't like it.
yeah, because you can say, well, that music offends me.
Right. Yeah. And I would get that a lot. Well, that offended me.
And First Corinthians says, don't
First
offend
Corinthians.
me.
And the first question I would say is, I would follow that up with a question. I said, did that offend you? It did. It offended me. What sin did you go out and commit as a result of listening to that music? Well, I'm not saying I sinned. I'm just saying I didn't. Oh, so you didn't like it. So we got to be careful when we throw that word
When
offend
Paul
around.
uses that word to offend, it really means to cause them
To stumble.
for their conscience to be violated.
Right. You're
Like-
causing them to go against.
Right. You're
something.
causing them to participate in something they feel is sinful, or they
Right.
not feel they are convinced is sinful.
They're convinced it's sinful.
Right. Even though it may not be sinful.
Right.
So in other words, if I do something that in my mind I'm convinced is a sinful thing, and it may not be sinful.
That's true.
Me eating the meat offered to an idol. Oh, that's sin. Nah, come on, eat it. It's not a big deal. Just eat it. And then I eat it,
Believing it's sin.
believing it's sin, and my conscience is violated.
I cause you to stumble.
Right. And my sin is not eating the meat. My sin
No.
is doing something that I, in my conscience, feel
violated
is
your
wrong.
right.
So I'm
Yeah.
in a sense, I'm willing to disobey God in that moment by
Yep.
doing something that I, in my conscience, believe is wrong.
Right. Which is why he says if you can't do something in faith,
Correct.
it is sin.
Right.
Okay? So
Right.
that's different than I just don't like it. That's so we got to make sure we understand biblically what it means to offend someone.
Yep. Yep.
Okay? Now, what was your original question?
Well, the original question is, well, we defined what does it mean to offend, right?
right.
So is there? Well, okay, before I go there, let me ask this: how does then the context of 1 Corinthians 8 through 11, because Paul ends that text, that kind of discussion by saying, whether therefore you eat or drink,
Yep. Do all.
because the context is about eating.
Yep.
So
Yep.
he's like, hey, whether you're eating meat offered to an idol,
Yep.
or whether you're drinking or
Yeah,
whatever,
or whatever you do.
do all to the glory of God. Now, a lot of people don't interpret that in its context. They say, well, I need to eat for the glory of God, so I'm eating for God's glory, like you can
Yeah.
eat like
Yeah.
your steak for God's glory. Like, I guess there's a sense in which you can be really thankful to God and appreciate Him for the steak or whatever.
Yeah.
That's not what
Yeah.
Paul's talking about.
Right.
Paul's saying, in your eating,
Yeah.
particularly of
Particular
things
meat.
offered, make sure that in the eating you're glorifying God. Well, what does that mean? That you're not causing another brother
Right.
to sin
That's the
and violate their
context.
conscience in
Right.
your eating.
Right.
Oh, so I will glorify my God by either eating or not eating the meat.
Right. Right.
Because there are times where Paul says, if it will offend them,
Yep.
cause them to struggle with doing something they believe in their conscience
Don't
is wrong,
eat it.
Paul says, I won't eat.
Not for my conscience, for your
Yeah.
conscience sake.
Now, Paul says, if I'm sitting by myself eating, I don't care.
Yep, absolutely.
If I go to someone's house and they say, hey, this meat was offered to the pagan god
Yep.
Dionysus,
Yep,
Paul says, in that moment, I won't eat.
yep, absolutely.
Because they're making it a point
Right,
of worship then.
right, right.
So, that being the case, how does this issue then, now of liberty, particularly the illustration of meat offered to idols in 1 Corinthians, how does that then apply to music?
Well, it depends on what context you're talking about.
Okay.
Because I've heard people say, well, I don't like what this church is doing musically.
This church?
Well, let's just say any church.
Okay.
And it offends me musically.
Yeah.
And there's a Corinthian mandate for leadership to not offend me. So that worship leader needs to change what he's doing because it's offending me. I've heard people try to apply it that way. I say, okay, you have a couple of problems. One, in the context of 1 Corinthians, while yes, he's talking about Christian liberty and yet don't do something to cause someone to stumble, that's not in the context of worship. That's individual living. That's personal live in the marketplace. Buying meat is not in a synagogue worshiping. So you're taking an issue now and placing it in the church. I think you have to be very careful with that dynamic. However, what does it look like? And I think as far as when it comes to leadership looking out among the people that they are shepherding and asking some questions like, okay, the music that we want to do, number one, is it going to have such an association with it that the very goal for which we're trying to do, which is to point people to Christ, is not going to happen? I think that's a wise question to ask. So if, I'm half Pennsylvania Dutch, right? If I were to go to my grandmom's church, which was a Lutheran church, and if you've ever been to a Lutheran church, it's very stoic, right? And say, hey, Grandma, I'd like to do a special, and get up there and drop a hip hop rap. Why would you do that? When culturally, that is not, they're not going to be able to relate to it. And all they're going to hear is, or have in their mind, are images of gangs, drugs, and sex. Why would you choose to do that?
So I go back to the original point. Is love governing that decision?
No, it's not. It's about
Right?
me at that point.
Exactly.
It's
And
about
sometimes-
me at that point because this is what I like.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it's not about you. And this is where the principle of Corinthians comes in. Rather prefer your brother over you. Right?
Yep.
So that's what the principle kind of looks like. I'm going to defer to what will edify you, not what I know I can handle.
Okay, so Ron, you're bringing in, drums, and you're bringing in these new songs, and you're not loving my generation, say, with all this new music you're bringing into our church.
Okay.
How do you respond to that?
Well-
if they're going to go with your argument
Yeah.
and love, you're
Yeah.
not loving me by bringing in this music.
Okay.
You're just pushing your own agenda. This, and by the way, this was the part of the worship wars that you and I fought, and so these are actual questions
Yeah.
and concerns that people that we ministered to worked with.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a couple questions you have to ask yourself about that scenario. Is your generation the only generation in this church?
Okay. Yep.
Let's just be real. Well, but this is the
Because a lot of times this is a generational thing.
it is a generational thing, right? Okay. So you're not loving us because that's not what we like. I can almost turn that around on you in love and say, and you're not loving that younger generation that's sitting next to you because you refuse to allow them.
Or vice versa. It could be you're not loving the older generation.
It could go back and
Why do we got to do these hymns? You know, and- yeah.
It can go. See, again, if you apply this principle of love, one should be deferring to the other.
Yep.
Well, what happens when you have both represented? Oh, and like for 17 years, who's representing me? I never got mine. I mean,
Sure.
so I'm just being honest. Like,
Yep.
okay?
Yep.
So both deferring to one another. is what the Scripture preaches. Now, I got to bring up something because this is the other thing that comes into play here, though, is this. When you go to a place of worship, somebody asked me this one time. They said, as I'm looking for a place to worship, is it wrong that one of the criteria, like on our list, as we're trying to find a place, that one of the criteria is music? Is that wrong, Pastor Ron? I said, no, that's not wrong. That's not wrong. They said, because I'm trying to find a church that culturally I relate to.
Yeah. You said language or music is
Music
is
is a language,
right?
yes. And they said, so, we've been in some churches in the area, but it's like, that's not our language. It's, there's nothing wrong with that.
Now, what if you're in a church and that church that you're already in starts to change their language or their
Yeah.
cultural musical
Okay.
worship style?
Which is where we were.
Yeah.
And this is where now the leadership has to take into account the people that you are shepherding, walk them through the change, teach the 1 Corinthian passage, teach on worship, and say, we're going to start changing what the norm has been, but here's why. Not because we don't love you, but because we love all these people that are here. And that's what that transition is, a very slow transition because it's met with, I don't like this, what are you doing? And all the stuff that we went through, right? So that transition can happen, but if it's not done in love, if it's not done without just cleaning house, without teaching through it, right? And without representing the people that are there.
Yeah. What if you're in a community that begins to change culturally?
Right.
So let's just, you're a predominantly white church, and all of a sudden your community is starting to become more ethnically diverse.
Yep.
Are you wrong if you don't change to some degree your worship style?
Well, are you wrong? I want to be careful with saying that you're wrong in a biblical sense of sinning.
Right.
And the reason I want to be careful saying that is because I came to a church that did not change for my sake.
Yeah.
Right? Would you be ministering effectively to them, not using the language through music that they are used to? Are you going to miss out on something there? Absolutely.
Well, and this kind of goes back to our discussion on multi-ethnic congregations,
Right,
And
right.
how much should you strive for multi-ethnic congregations?
Right.
The answer to that was, what does your community look
What
like?
does your community look like? Right.
So if your community is half Hispanic and half white, and all you do is music that communicates to the white,
Right.
population,
There's a problem.
I think there's a problem.
Which
Now-
is why, and all joking aside, with ragging on Dan, I never expected him to do black
Right.
gospel as a norm
Yeah.
at Faith Baptist Church when there's how many people in my family? 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 of us.
Right.
That's ridiculous, right? And so again, who is it that God has entrusted to you? Who are you trying to shepherd? Who are you trying to feed? You have to be aware of what those cultures are that are out there.
Well, one of the reasons a lot of denominational churches are quite frankly dying, and all you go in and it's everyone's 65 or older, and you listen to the style of worship, you observe the style of worship, you can leave and say, well, they're not speaking the language of the next generation. They're
Right.
only speaking the language of the current generation.
Right.
And we went through that here. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I noticed when I was the youth pastor for so many years is our kids would faithfully be a part of our church, grow up in our church,
Yep.
participate in our youth ministries, go on missions trips, go off to college, graduate college. They wouldn't come back here to church.
Yeah.
They weren't coming back here. They were
Right.
going to other churches. They
Right.
weren't denying their faith. They were still serving and worshiping God, but they were going to other churches that were connecting with them. They would make statements like, well, I'm connecting more over there with
Right.
what's going on.
Right.
And that might sound, oh, well, they shouldn't be so selfish. They should, and get it. But there may be levels of maturity there.
Sure.
But
Sure.
but my point in coming to leadership at that point in the history of this church was, hey guys, we will lose the next generation And yeah, maybe it's a maturity issue on their part, but we're still going to lose their generation because we are
Right.
not speaking their language
Right.
at all.
Right.
I mean, we can give them, we can speak their language through the youth ministry and they can grow up through that. But once they're out of youth ministry,
Yeah.
and they have a choice where they're going to go to church, I said they're not choosing to come back to this church.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was a real concern I had for the
Sure.
next generation.
Yeah.
And I was afraid that we were going to become a church that in the next 20 years we would be, a church of all older generation
Yeah.
Christians with no younger generation.
Yep.
And so that's one of the things that really kind of pushed us to actually not just talk about changing the style of worship,
Yeah.
but to actually changing and implementing changes.
Yeah.
I actually have a video that I made a few years back where I just pulled. It was a part of a sermon I did on worship here, and this has probably been even 6 or 7 years ago, quite a few years ago, before even Dan was a part of our team, and it showed all the different. I took clips of worship services over the past 20 some years.
yeah. I like to see that.
And it showed how we made those transitions. There were some awkward Sundays. You remember, you led worship through all of that.
Yeah, I remember.
There were worse Sundays where we'd start out and we would sing traditional hymns with a piano and an organ. And then, all right, now the praise team's going to come up and
Yep.
now they're going to sing, Here I Am to Worship,
Yep.
and they're going to sing whatever worship songs with a guitar.
Yeah.
And then they would leave the stage and next song we'd sing.
Yep.
And it looking back, we're like, oh my word, we did that. That was awkward. But in the moment, in the time, it was
Trying
just
to navigate through.
trying to navigate
What
through
does this
it. Yeah.
look like?
Yeah,
Right?
It was weird and awkward, and it forced us with some uncomfortable, and awkward times.
Yeah.
And so we took it slowly.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
try to walk people through it. To your point, teach
Yeah.
through it, but we couldn't just teach about it. We had to actually
What's it look like?
put it in motion.
Yeah.
Right.
And again, it shows too. One of the things that made that difficult is the fact that music is so powerful.
yeah. Yeah.
Right? It's a powerful language, and
Yeah.
it's almost like going to someone who doesn't speak French and saying, "We're going to start preaching in French."
Yeah. And there were people that left and went to another church because
Yep.
of it. But then I started to notice a change. I started noticing the next generation saying, "Hey, thanks for speaking our language. Thanks. Hey, that was awkward, and it maybe didn't sound great, but we appreciate
Right.
you making the effort at least
Right.
in those early days
Yeah.
of kind of moving in our direction."
Right.
And it spoke volumes to that next generation.
Yeah.
And they started sticking around. They started staying. They started raising their families in the church.
Yeah.
And
And again, it doesn't, and this is the thing, it's not about snuffing out the older generation.
not at all.
And saying you're irrelevant and you're, it's not, but for me, it came down to this as I looking back at that whole dynamic. If music is a part of worship, but it's not the totality of worship.
good point.
Number
Yep.
one, right? Can I, and I would always use myself as an example, can I give up my language that I'm comfortable with if it means that these people are coming up who now can be discipled, understand God and the love of Christ? Like, for me, I'm talking about for me personally, was that a big sacrifice for me? And for me, no, it wasn't, which is why I led music for 8 or 9 years, not being anything that I wanted, right? And so I think that's part of that principle of prefer this one over yourself,
Yep.
right? For their sake. And I would joke all the time. I said, guys, when I leave here, first thing I do, I get in my van, I put on my music. And we continue our worship service as we leave the parking lot, right? But, and again, that's not to say, so therefore just get rid of all this kind and just have this kind. I'm just saying, no, there's a broader principle here.
Yep.
It's a broader principle. I'm going to prefer you over me for the sake of drawing people to Christ, having people come in and hear the gospel. That just has more weight for me than for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, me getting what I want to hear.
Yep.
And that's how I process that.
I think you always made the point. If my worship consists of only what I'm getting on Sunday morning, then
There's a bigger problem.
there's a bigger problem.
And so, yes, that's why I go back and say when people ask me, well, is it wrong for me to look for a church where it's my style of music? No, it's not wrong. Here's what is wrong. If you can't find that because of where you live, so therefore you don't go to church.
Well, and I would certainly say if your church's style of worship is changing to something you don't like, that's not warrant for you to leave and
No.
find another congregation
No,
because
no.
God's called you to that body
Right.
to love them. So how powerful is it when someone who says, I don't really connect with that style of worship, but for their sake,
That's
I'm
my
gonna
point.
I'm gonna worship with them,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna focus on the message of those songs, and I'm gonna glean from that, and I'm still gonna
Yeah.
worship
Right.
regardless of the
Right.
fact that it may not be my language.
Right.
What that does for those individuals who it is their language, that speaks volume to them.
Absolutely.
Because I can look at an older generation Christian who, I get it, this song isn't their cup of tea, but they stand there and they sing, and they engage. I look at that with a lot of respect, saying,
Yeah.
thank you for loving
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
by, and vice versa. I want to love them well enough to be able to communicate and just worship freely with songs that speak in musical genres that speak to them.
Right. Right. Right.
And so, to the point, when that love is two-way, it does create a community that it's really a powerful thing.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
And then of course that goes beyond just the preference of music. It goes
No,
into our
it's
preference
bigger.
of everything.
Absolutely.
So-
absolutely.
All right. Well, on that note, we will send it out with some music.
What kind of music
So-
we playing, Dan?
I don't know. I don't have my headphones
You
in
don't have your
today, so
headphones? All right, I see his neck is moving, so it's jamming music. All right. So I had to leave the church, come back do a podcast to get some black gospel.
This really isn't even black gospel. It's more like Weather Channel music.
Oh, well, no, that ain't it. Okay. No, you must have changed. I didn't pick no Weather Channel music.
the music that we intro in and out with is one you found.
No. Okay, I'm gonna review that, and I might have to update that because I didn't pick no Weather Channel music.
That's fine. See you next week.